Hi, this is Carrie Brownstein.
This is DJ Premier.
This is Darren Aronofsky.
You got the RZA right here.
Rose McGowan.
Radiohead.
Aisha Tyler.
Tribe Called Quest.
Fred Armisen.
Prince Paul.
Javier Munoz. Seth Meyers.
Tracy Cosmos.
Flying Lotus.
Hi, we're Chaim, and you're listening to the Talkhouse Podcast.
What's up? I'm Elia Einhorn. Welcome back to the Talkhouse Podcast. Today I'm joined from Chicago by
Josh Modell, executive editor.
And we have a very, very cool show for you today. The one and only Steve Albini in conversation with Devo's Jerry Casale.
Yeah, man, this is an incredible conversation that these two guys had. We recorded it backstage at the Desert Daze Fest in Southern California, which is kind of this crazy psychedelic festival with bands like Tame Impala, King Gizzard, My Bloody Valentine.
The lineup was incredible, and they had some psych heavy hitters. To that end, we also cut an episode there with Boogerines and Kikagaku Moyo. So listeners, that'll be coming soon. Now, Josh, when our intrepid reporter Keenan Kush came back from the fest and sent me the audio for this one thing that really made me smile was hearing Steve Albini say, maybe halfway through this talk, "This is the sort of stuff no one ever talks about. These are the questions I've had for 30 years.
Yeah, it's amazing. I don't think there are many bands that Steve Albini is going to go fanboy on, but Jerry Casale of Devo was one, and it turned into a great conversation. Steve asks really good questions. These guys really get deep into what they've done over the past 30, 40 years.
These are two music legends who have lived it. These are guys who have defined the music of their time. I mean, I definitely first heard of Steve Albini when he produced Nirvana's In Utero.
Yeah, and what struck me is that these two guys who have had very different careers have something really, really important in common, and that is they have sort of always followed their own path. Like Albini is a take-no-shit producer and musician who has no interest in commercial success, and Devo was started as an art project in Ohio that happened to have a fluke hit in the early 80s with Whip It that sort of defined and undefined their career in a way.
Exactly. Now, Devo was comprised of two sets of brothers. There's Jerry and Bob Casale, there's Mark and Bob Mothersbaugh, and there's Alan Myers. Devo are solidly in that category of what I call brilliant weirdos. These are guys who helped change the sound of mainstream music. Most recently, Jerry released It's All Devo. That was in 2016 and featured Jerry with Italy's Funk Investigation. Now, some exciting Devo news, listeners. They have been nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame class of 2019. That's along with some amazing artists like Radiohead, The Cure, Janet Jackson, Stevie Nicks. And you can actually vote for him. So, if you think Jerry does a good job on today's episode, toss him a bone.
Yeah, they seem like a long shot. They could use your help. Steve Albini, on the other hand, seems very unlikely to ever be nominated or inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, nor would he probably want to be. He's sort of always set himself apart as very kind of anti-music industry, while also actually gaining probably the most fame for producing, although he hates the word producing, albums for Nirvana and the Pixies. He's also produced probably 1,000 bands that none of us have ever heard of at his studio in Chicago, Electrical Audio.
It's an amazing place. I've gotten to check it out before. It's a fantastic recording studio.
He's also, of course, the singer and guitarist of Big Black, the classic noisy rock band, and Shellac. And he and Jerry also spoke about an interesting hobby of Steve's, right, Elia?
Right. Now, this is really funny. Albini is not only a world-renowned producer, as you say, he doesn't like the term, but that's what he is. He's also a world-renowned poker player and won one of the major categories this year in the World Series of Poker Tournament. This was over the summer in June. He took home over $100,000 jackpot for 7-card stud wins.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I thought one of the more interesting parts of this talk is that he says he plays poker only for the money and not because it's fun. Now, when I first moved to Chicago, I wrangled myself an invite to the Electrical Audio poker game, which he ran. And I've never seen a guy having more fun playing poker, which may be because he was sitting at a table full of suckers and, blasting AC/DC and Thin Lizzy.
He had his hand around your wallet already, Josh.
Luckily, it was a very low-stakes game. Everybody would buy in for $20 or something, and then Steve would just take it all.
I love it, man. That's awesome. Well, it was fantastic hearing him talk about what he considers to be the very different professions of poker playing and engineering records. We also get to hear the guys chop it up about the earliest years of Devo's existence and the political and social climate of the times.
I loved hearing about Devo's complex relationship with Neil Young.
Who knew?
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, Neil Young has sort of become the godfather of punk and sort of worked his way into that. But at the time, Neil Young didn't seem particularly cool, right?
Not to the mid-'70s punks. We also hear about Brian Eno's proclivity for ménage trois.
Yeah, which spins off from a story about David Bowie wanting to produce Devo, but not ending up doing it.
Amazing stuff, and there are so many, many more stories here. Josh, should we roll the tape?
Yeah, I'm excited to hear it again.
All right. This is Gerald Casale. I never said that. Somebody said that about me. Somebody said I said that.
You've always used Casale and not Casale.
Well, Casale is Italian.
Yeah. No, but I mean, when you were growing up. People, Yeah.
That's
Because I know, like, Stephen Colbert. He was Stephen Colbert when he was growing up, and then he changed it to Colbert when he got to be famous.
No, I mean, my family, the relatives all called me Casale. After that, it got butchered 10 ways to hell.
Sure,
that. Yeah. There was Casale. Mm-hmm. There was Casalis. They would have put an S on the end. I don't know why. Casalis. There was Castle. They anglified it.
Right. Your brother was in the band.
Yes.
With you. This is Steve Albini, by the way. I'm Steve Albini from Shellac of North America, sound recording engineer, musician, born in Pasadena, California. I remember nothing about it. Grew up in Montana. Is that enough? Sound check.
I think
over.
Pasadena was a lot cooler, that is, temperature-wise, when you were there as a youth.
The only thing I know about Pasadena, I learned this from my father, who worked for various aerospace companies in California. And
that's why you were there.
He was getting the last of his degrees from Caltech, and then he stayed in the area working for various aerospace companies. Hughes Aircraft among them. But anyway, he told me that there was a promenade of palm trees that had these long beards on them. And whenever UCLA won an important football game, hooligans would set these long beards on fire. And so these palm fronds, flaming palm fronds, would drift out over the city. And it sounded absolutely spectacular. It made me very sad that I missed that.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it when certain parts of society sanction mob rule because it's an institution that's revered like football.
There used to be a thing where there would be intense rivalries between different schools.
Right.
And then they would have, for their homecoming game where they would play each other or whatever, it would be like a big fete. They would make a bonfire and burn effigies and all that kind of stuff.
Many
Nobody
fights, too.
Yeah.
Many fights.
But I mean, that kind of thing now, it's reduced down to, just like cheap beer at a bar or something like that. Like if you wear your Trojans colors, you get a plate of wings or something,
Yeah.
No, it's not as much of a bacchanalia.
No, I mean, these days, maybe the SWAT team would show up. Everything's clamped down, the clampdown.
I listened to your talk earlier today. It was absolutely fascinating, every second of it. And one thing struck me about your position in Devo, the straddling quality of Devo, where it straddled the art world and the music world and straddled the political world and the artistic world, but the most significant straddle is that you broached the sort of great filter that was punk rock. Like, I came of age during the punk rock era, and my appreciation of music is 100% formed by my experiences through the lens of punk rock, right? And at the time, that was seen as a clean break with the past.
Right.
That everything that happened prior to punk rock was jaded and louche and weak, and everything that was inspired by punk rock was the chariot carrying forward. Like the thing that we would all be riding from then on out was the inspiration of punk rock. Very, very, very few people and very few bands or institutions made it through that filter without it being an indulgence. And one of the rare ones was Neil Young. Like all of my punk friends, while they were quick to discard their Led Zeppelin and their Ted Nugent material, right? They were quick to discard all of the baggage of the 70s. They identified with Neil Young. And I am fascinated by the sort of kinship that Neil Young had with Devo.
So were we.
Yeah. Can you explain how you, like, as you mentioned in your talk, you were there, a participant during the Kent State shootings. Right. And so you were formed in the same social environment as Neil Young's most active and most vocal political period.
Right. I should have been a hippie, but I wasn't.
Yeah.
Our attitude towards Neil Young was we kind of jokingly referred to him as the grandfather of granola rock. But we knew even then that he was more primal, more basic. We liked the way he recorded. We liked the crude guitar solos.
Yeah.
And there was also, even though he had that alto voice and sounded pretty, there was a lot of anger in there. And that's what we shared with anything from that era. We also had very justifiable anger at illegitimate authority. We hated the prevailing administration. Mm-hmm. We hated the evangelicals. We hated authoritarian cops and teachers. Mm-hmm. Anybody that said, do as I say as long as you live in this house.
Right.
Right? So we were punk, like in the true sense of punk, which was, punk was a fuck you to prevailing authority, especially when it carried no kind of validity,
Yeah.
Right? There are rules that you agree on, but there were many rules, most rules that you didn't. And now you were a lot younger than me. I think you're at least 14 years younger than me. And so you had that advantage, I think, of being a young teenager in punk's original blast, when punk was a salvo, almost like a course correction, like a market correction, right?
It seemed like, and I've talked to other people who were there and whose aesthetic and whose ideals were formed in the same era as mine. And all of us who were there watching it unfold saw punk as a kind of an instant. Like there was a moment where everything changed. And it wasn't a new idiom or a new form that we had to learn. It was basically it was sort of a starting gun.
Yeah.
And everyone who was there and witnessed it was changed by it,
Yeah, it was great. It was back to square one. It was minimalism. It was do-it-yourself crude.
And all of my punk friends identified with and appreciated Devo as having those ideas ahead of the curve,
Well, that's true. See, that's why we were kind of ambivalent towards punk being older when we created Devo. We were older than a lot of the punks. We were older than the Clash. We were older than the Sex Pistols. Not by much. But what we didn't like right away was this orthodoxy. And because we were in the middle of it ourselves, and we got called punk because of the speeds we played at, because of the sounds and the energy and the anger in the lyrics. But we were not part of the orthodoxy, which we found to be stultifying and anti-intellectual. You had to dress a certain way. You had to act a certain way. As soon as we went to England in 1978, we encountered all the punks, and they were largely racist and right-wing white guys and very anti-intellectual. And that's where Devo had to part ways with them. Our anger wasn't born of resentment or inarticulateness or not understanding what was going on. I totally fucking understood what was going on. And that's why I was pissed.
And the temporal difference between the milieu that you guys were formed in, the 70s, and the late 70s, 80s, which is where my generation of musician came from. Even speaking purely on a political basis, there were reprehensible characters. Nixon was a piece of shit. Johnson was a piece of shit. A lot of people were reprehensible. But there was always some facet that sort of reclaimed their humanity for a moment. Like Nixon's administration started the Environmental Protection Agency, and he's probably the only person who could have gotten an Environmental Protection Agency started. Sure, Johnson was principally responsible for escalating the Vietnam War. He also passed the Civil Rights Act, which was the accomplishment that he identified with most. So there were redeeming qualities or redeeming facets to even the most reprehensible public figures at that time.
I think that you make a really important point. Because,
as near as I can tell, Ronald Reagan was the first pure piece of shit to ever be a pinnacle public politician. Well, everybody else, they had their failings, they had their things that you agreed with them and disagreed with them on. Primarily, they were motivated by, rather base self-interest. But Ronald Reagan was the first guy where there was literally nothing about anything that he did that stands up to any scrutiny. Not a single idea, not a single notion that if you look at it with clear eyes, you could get behind.
Well, yeah, you hit the nail on the head, because up until that point, I'd say that even Devo, and I can only talk about collectively so much, but certainly speaking for myself, there was still this feeling, as you bring up, that there was still a system worth trying to save, that there was still something that worked underneath the corrupt bad actors, and that there were bad apples spoiling the barrel, right? But if you got rid of the bad apples, you had a chance.
Yeah.
And I quickly veered from that to, the whole thing being rotten to the core. And that when you really quit just playing this WWF Republicans versus Democrats, where the main difference was the color of the suit, that human nature itself and the political system that it reflected was beyond anything that could be fixed. It was a cancer. And Reagan was the guy that finished it off, because he was a complete huckster, a complete insincere con man actor.
It was the first administration where you had the feeling that every single facet of government was being exploited to preserve the power of people who already had entrenched power.
And it's why the ideologues to this day revere him. Yeah. And all Trump is the macho Camacho character from Idiocracy version of Reagan, where strip away any of the false civility and the silver-tongued grace and just show the horrid, vile, mean-spirited guy, right? Take the mask off.
Yeah, I think the political identity of the right wing right now is that. I think Donald Trump is just a purely craven, self-interested creep.
Yeah.
He represents the naked greed of someone who's always been rich, wants to stay rich, wants to get richer, doesn't think rules apply to him, doesn't think his rich friends should have to follow the rules.
And he says that.
Yeah.
He says it. And he goes, I like people that say nice things about me. Yeah. And he says, why should I listen to somebody that's not rich? They're a loser. Yeah. It's incredible.
Yeah. And I agree with you that I don't think that there are institutions left underneath that power grab that can defeat it. So it's going to take an extraordinary effort, and it's going to be an eradication effort rather than a conversion effort.
There's no good outcome here for people of reason or conscience. It's going to degenerate further into an uneducated, angry mob going against a power structure that's so concentrated and so over the top that what you'll see is kind of a police state, fascist rule.
And this is kind of a distillation and the liquor of Devo, as you were describing it from its earliest inception.
We were warning.
Do you get any satisfaction from having been right?
No. I mean, thanks for asking that, because people would think we would, like, ha, I told you so. But this is, no one decent deserves this, what we're now living through, to have your face rubbed in shit every day, right? Orwell once said the future. He said this in 1948 after he came out with Animal Farm. Somebody asked him, well, what do you see for the future? He said, the future is the boot coming down in the face of humanity over and over. And that's what we're seeing now. The consolidation of corporate control, the erosion of freedoms, of individual liberty, of democratic rule of law. It's done.
Well, that's all tremendously depressing.
Sure is.
I want to ask, you started out as an art project. Did you feel a kinship to the sort of proto-punk and experimental and underground bands of the U.S. at the time? I'm thinking specifically of bands like Peru and the Electric Eels and bands like MX80 from Bloomington and Dancing Cigarettes from Indianapolis and those sorts of bands. Did you correspond with them? Did you do trade shows with them? Did you
In some cases, we traded shows, and certainly Perubu over and over. And, David, what was his name? David Thomas?
Yeah.
He hated us. We liked him, but he hated us. He thought we were bullshit. And that kind of hurt, because I was the last person to give a shit about all the assholes that hated Devo. That almost energized me. Like,
Right.
the worse the people were that hated Devo, the more we wanted to do more, right? Like goad them and confront them. But when there's somebody you respect, especially from the artistic community, and they say you're bullshit, that's not fun.
And was there a scene for bands
There was a scene
you
in
guys
Cleveland.
in Cleveland.
Cleveland.
Yeah. So
There was-
bands like the Waitresses
Yes.
and the Tin Huey and
Yeah.
and did you guys hang out? Did you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even before that, when I was in the 15, 60, 75 blues band, the Numbers Band, run by Bob Kidney, which was locally and in Ohio quite famous. They really were good. Terry Hine was Chrissy Hine's older brother. He was a jazz musician who played saxophone in 15, 60, 75 when I played bass. Chrissy Hine would come around to our rehearsals down at the Cove in Kent, which was this subterranean club, perfect for what we were doing. All the students from the university came there. And she would demand to be let up on stage to sing and play harmonica and fight with her brother who kept telling her to get out. We had to practice.
And this would have been in what years?
Like 1972, 73.
My word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then she'd hang out at the student union at Kent State University and pick verbal fights with people. She was always really aggressive. Like at 14, 15 years old, she was really scary. And then she'd leave the rehearsal going, "Fuck you, you guys suck." And 2 years later, she was off on her own going to hang out in London. And we know the story from there.
Yeah. So like now there's a fairly established circuit of venues, and there are, booking agents and people like that who will organize tours, and there are a lot of bands that make their principal income touring. I can't imagine that there were a lot of sympathetic venues for
No.
what you were doing in the mid-'70s. How did you organize shows, and how did you,
I would pretend to be the manager, and in one famous case, I lied that we were a cover band and gave them a list of stuff that we did, including like Bad Company and things like, Foreigner. And then we get there and we're in the blue fireman's work suits with these clear plastic masks on that were just clear plastic with eyebrows and lips. And we come out that way and you can see this club owner going, "What the fuck?" Right? And I go, "Here's one by Bad Company," and we go into Be Still.
Right, sure.
And so after a few songs, the patrons are screaming at us and throwing beer bottles at us. The club owner paid us to quit. He said, "Here's $50 if you'll get the fuck out of here." And we thought that was great.
Yeah.
We took the $50
$50
and
was
went
real money then, yeah.
It was. We went to a pizza place, Ray's Pizza. And
So how did you transition from just playing shows and stuff into being, like, your first significant releases were on Stiff Records?
right, we had a year before that, had that record out in the United States. We recorded it on 4-track. I drove down to Cincinnati to Queen City Records with Mark. We stayed overnight. We had it pressed there. We made 2,000 copies there.
Right. Which was ambitious at the time.
I
That was
know. Well, they wouldn't do any less.
very optimistic, yeah.
Wouldn't do any less. And then we sat in an apartment in Akron, and Mark and I had designed the original 3-flap cover, and we assembled it with double stick tape. And it took days and days to package these 2,000 records.
The record stuffing party became a rite of passage for all the independent bands that were inspired by all the early punk bands and independent bands. I participated in dozens of record stuffing parties for my records and my friends' records and things like that.
So there's this place in Cleveland called Videodrome that had all the independent singles and was bringing in the stuff from England. So I think we sold 50 copies to them. Wow. All right. And then this guy, Greg, somebody from Bomp Records in California, I had sent samples of it to my friends in California. They had got it to Bomp. Then he ordered 200 copies.
Wow.
And somehow Stiff Records got a hold of it.
As an import.
And they wanted 1,000 copies.
Wow.
I know. You're interviewing me and I'm talking too much. We should interview you.
Well, I want to pursue this a little. This is the sort of stuff nobody ever talks about. This is all the stuff the questions I've had for 30 years.
It mushroomed like everything, right? If you're doing everything you can, right? Everything you can think of doing every day. And then at a certain point, if you're lucky, you reach critical mass. Because there's a lot of bands and a lot of artists that they're not lazy. They do everything they can do. They try hard and they miss. They miss the bullseye.
Yeah.
We hit a sweet spot and it started mushrooming.
So Stiff Records, the label,
Right.
the stuff that they were putting out, they put out some sort of stereotypical punk records, but a lot of the stuff that they became known for eventually was kind of rootsy, traditional in a way, rock and roll music, which seems antithetical to what Devo was about. Were you aware of Stiff Records and their reputation? Were you aware of their aesthetic before they said, hey, we want a bunch of your records?
Our problem, in a way it was a problem. We were such purists and thinking so far ahead that everybody we dealt with seemed stupid, and we thought their aesthetics were cornball. We never met anyone we were impressed with until we got to meet David Bowie and Brian Eno.
Right.
But as far as club owners and record guys, they were the worst people in the world. And the only thing I remember being concerned with from what I'd read was that Stiff would never pay us. And sure as fuck, they never did. That's what they should have been notorious for, is I go, oh, okay, I get it why you're called Stiff Records, you fucks, you stiffed us.
Yeah.
And they laughed at me. Dave Robinson laughed at me. We never got paid.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah. But it put us on this like underground stage that was getting a lot of press and a lot of heat.
Yeah. And your first album came out in America on a major label.
Right.
And that record was made with some resources, as you were describing, like a couple of weeks at a very nice studio with Brian Eno.
Brian Eno paid for it.
He paid for the record up front.
He paid for it.
That his idea was that he was going to make a record and then you would find a label, or he had an offer?
He knew that I had gotten us to the point where we had a right of first refusal deal with Warner Brothers, where they laid out exactly what we'd get if they liked the record. But they wouldn't sign a deal with us until
they had to hear the record first.
And the way they sealed that right of first refusal was, in order to get us to Germany, it was going to cost back then about $10,000 to send our equipment over there, because Devo's sound was based on all of our personalized, customized equipment. We weren't a plug and play band. And back then, to get your stuff into Germany, you had to have a carnet, you had to this and that. So to get us and our equipment over there was $10,000. That's a lot of money then. Warner said, here's a check for $10,000. If you sign this check, you're agreeing to this deal if we like it. Well, the deal was a good deal because I had kept turning down all these bad deals. But it was a production deal where we controlled the money. So we could pick the studio. We could design creatively what we wanted. We could spend the money the way we wanted, unlike a lot of deals. And Brian, saw that deal. So he knew what he'd get as a producer. So he said, in order for us not to wait any longer, here, it's going to cost like $40,000. I'm going to pay. I know I'm going to get my money back. They're going to like this record.
Oh, that's tremendous.
And that's what happened.
And there was something of a mild competition, I hear, between John Cale and Brian Eno.
Bowie.
And David Bowie.
Bowie was going to produce us, but Bowie kept delaying, and then he had just a Gigolo movie, and then and he kept pushing it. And I felt we were missing our big moment, our zeitgeist, because the Talking Heads had released, Blondie had released. Of course, the Clash and the Sex Pistols were out. B-52s were coming out. I felt this is silly. We've been around in basements and clubs in Cleveland since 1974. We got to go. And I told David that. He goes, all right, I can understand why you're antsy. I'll tell you what, I'm going to fly you to New York. You're going to meet Brian Eno. Brian will do it when you want to do it. That is if you like him. Well, of course, it's like he was one of our heroes. And Mark and I spent 2 nights hanging out with Brian Eno in New York City, and the guy in Roxy Music with all the drag makeup on and the wings and the glitter and the wild hairdo. And we meet him, and he's like a balding, blonde, trimmed hair, little V-neck sweater, and a preppy button-down collar shirt, corduroy pants. But of course, he's staying at the Sherry Netherland. And of course, he's got phone calls every 5 minutes with girls. And he starts telling us stories about how, you know, when he and David were working together, there'd be all these chances for ménages, and David would say no. He only wanted the black girl. And I remember Mark and I going, really? You mean David could have had a 3-way? Wow, what was wrong with him? Like, we're these goons from Ohio that never had any ménages. And we couldn't understand why David Bowie would do this. And he goes, yeah, that's all he's interested in. And then Brian said, oh, and then David would gladly tell the girls, go with Brian. So he talked about how much he liked hanging out with David for that reason. But he was really smart, really well-spoken, really smart. And by that time, he was that Zen guy with the oblique strategies cards.
Right. And that was the only time you worked with him, was on that first record. But you carried on making records for years.
Yeah. Well, at the time, he hadn't produced anything, other than his own stuff.
Right.
And when we were with him, of course, we were these industrial brutalists, minimalists. He kept trying to add pretty string sounds from a synth. He kept trying to do harmonies with vocals. And he put all these tracks on the record, but when it came to mixing, Mark and I would pull down the faders because it was antithetical to what we'd been trying to do.
That first record was and is a landmark, but did you consider doing more stuff with him, or was it just never materialized after that first
I don't
session?
think he liked working with us, and we liked him personally, but we never maintained any professional relationship. We had a hard time with producers because we had all these innovative sounds and all these ideas, and they couldn't get it. I mean, Bob Margoloff on the third record, it worked out great because we let him do what he wanted to do, and he was actually bringing out the funkiness of Devo and the foot, the kick, and the bass interplay, which had been missing on recordings. And he didn't mess with our sounds. He let us do our sounds.
It's really interesting if you listen to the sounds that you guys were making on those early, the hardcore Devo recordings and the Stiff records and the first album and your independent singles. Like a lot of those sounds, like the sort of brutish synthesizer sounds,
noise,
and the uncultured kind of electronic percussion sounds and that sort of stuff.
Yep.
An awful lot of that stuff was echoed years later in a lot of the more aggressive electronic music, which is now its own canon,
Yeah.
And but the music that you were making never seemed functional to me. A lot of that electronic music that I'm describing, industrial and post-industrial club music, a lot of it has these harsh sounds or these sort of unprettied sounds, but it seems to be done in service of a much more simplistic move. Like it seems to be done as functional music where, well, this is a pattern you can dance to. We'll do this for quite some time, as opposed to it being like part of a phrase that you guys would do as a single gesture and then move on.
Yeah. I guess we were just writing songs with our aesthetic. We were never dance music. I mean, maybe at one point people thought we might be, but we never intentionally sat down and did dance music. We were not into that. And I know you went off on a rant about dance music at one point, or EDM. I read it. It's funny. But you would let the guy sample you anyway. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the thing that I've picked up from having worked with so many different kinds of people over a long period of time is that every kind of music has an element of legitimacy to it. Every kind of music, no matter how derivative or how slavishly mimicking that music is, there is a purity to it. There's an element of sincerity there. And if the people executing it observe that, then it sounds valid to them.
I know what you mean.
And that's really the only barometer.
Yeah.
Working in the studio as an engineer for other people, my taste and my aesthetics don't really come into the picture, or they shouldn't in any case. Like if I was working on a record with you, it wouldn't be fair to you if you had to be in the back of your mind thinking, I wonder if he thinks this is corny, you know? And
Unless we asked you.
And it wouldn't be fair to you for me to be thinking, oh, that's corny. You know, it's not a legitimate part of my function as an engineer to be like sculpting your music as far as taste is concerned. I feel like I've made better records. I've done a better job for more kinds of clients. The more I have quieted any sort of impulse toward authorship, you know, like you were describing that your producer was putting extra stuff on your record, and then when it came time to mix it, you just kept those faders down.
And he didn't like that.
I mean, it would save a lot more time if he just didn't do that, you know?
Well, yeah. Yeah, I understand. And I mean, you're a thoughtful person and a introspective, analytical person. So I think that's why you can have this eclectic discography of engineering, production that you have over all these years. It's insane how many different kinds of music that you've produced and engineered, but you do it right. It's kind of like Josh Freese with drumming. He's somehow avoided being a studio drummer, even though he is, because whenever he's like Woody Allen and Zelig, right?
Right.
When he is with Devo, he's Alan Myers, and he's really got it authentically. And when he's with Nine Inch Nails, he's doing it.
Yeah.
And when he's with Sting, he's this pop guy. It's bizarre, and the drumming styles are completely different. Then you see him with A Perfect Circle, and it's this drudge mudge, and he's doing it. And you're watching him do it. So each thing's authentic when he does it, you know.
That's one of the curses of being an excellent drummer, is that there's a parallel here. It sounds like I'm bragging, but I'm not bragging. I had a conversation with Jimmy Page once about being a studio musician. And he was, before Led Zeppelin got off the ground, he was a first call session musician in England. And he was known for being able to sight read any piece of music, and he played effortlessly and played perfectly. And as he developed that reputation, he started getting offered the more choice, the more prime gigs. Like starting out, he would be part of a rhythm section, and then as he got a better reputation, maybe he would be the first call of an arranger to play in a combo, and then he would take the occasional solo, you know. And when he had a really great reputation as a reader, he was being offered the most lucrative gigs. And the most lucrative gigs were sight reading 30 minutes of Muzak for background recordings as part of an orchestra. That was the most lucrative gig for a session musician.
Back then, right.
Because they had to play an entire album side without stopping and making no mistakes, sight reading a medley of popular songs.
And this is before the Yardbirds even?
During that same era. So
isn't that bizarre? I didn't know that.
The conundrum is, the better you are at your craft in that world of being a studio musician, the more bland and the less interesting the music is that you're going to be working on. And take as an example, a terrific drummer who makes his bones in a rock band or something like that, and he gets a reputation as being a drummer. So then, then he's going to be a session guy for a singer-songwriter, and he distinguishes himself there. And then before you know it, he has a lifetime gig playing hi-hat and four-square bass drum behind Lyle Lovett or something, or behind some pop singer. Doing nothing none of the invigorating, sort of challenging, exciting.
Actually doing something that a bunch of drummers could do, but they want the name.
They want the very best guy, so he's reliable,
Right.
And that's the kind of curse of being an excellent session musician.
Well, you would think that would wean out of you the true talent, like you would kill it somehow by doing that. But then you listen to Page when he's the last guy to be the lead guitarist in the Yardbirds.
Yeah.
And you already hear Led Zeppelin in him. You already hear the style. So he couldn't help it. He's got the style.
Yeah. And you start to wonder, what was the calculus when he decided that he was going to be a band leader?
Right.
Was it I'm going to make less money than I would have made playing Muzak, but the quality of my life and my creative satisfaction will be greater? Or did he have an instinct that it was actually going to end up being more lucrative? That's the kind of calculus I'm always curious about when you see,
I mean, I wouldn't know because we never had that instinct. We felt compelled to do what we had to do. It was just about, we were artists. We were visual artists first anyway. And we couldn't not do this. We couldn't help but be original. We could have never even had the choice of doing what Jimmy Page did.
Yeah. Did Devo as a band, did you guys ever find yourself doing something that you later regretted as a kind of compromise? Because you worked in all levels of the industry, from where you had to lie about being a cover band to get a gig at a bowling alley, to where you're one of the major touring acts.
Yeah. Well, not us collectively regretting, not us collectively, but I have been quite plain spoken and vocal, because that's me, about the album Shout and how much I disliked what was going on when that album was being made. But it was like, basically, that's where Mark Mothersbaugh decided, okay, I don't really care what you think. If there's going to be a party, it's my party. This is what's going on. You can collaborate or not. You can leave, And
so that was an internal band
Yeah, he was
issue.
married to the Fairlight, and I hated the tediousness of the Fairlight and what the sounds he was getting from the Fairlight. And it was disenfranchising Alan as a drummer, and he was really into his, drum samples, and rather than us having real drums. And the music, at that point, everything he did was very busy. It was now pretending towards where he'd go when he scored kids' cartoons and kids' movies. Everything was real busy and chattery and caffeinated and silly sounding, like a lot of tiny little sounds.
But as far as your interface with the rest of the music business or your audience or
no, we never played ball.
You never felt like you were forced to do anything.
They tried.
Yeah.
I mean, it was after Whip It. As soon as Whip It was a hit, I thought that would have propelled us to the next level, but instead, now they think they got it for the first time. That's Devo. Okay, we want another Whip It. And they couldn't believe it when they were hearing new songs that didn't sound like Freedom of Choice or Whip It at all. And we were using different equipment because we were moving on. That was Devo, right? Devo was always very experimental and innovative, so it was like we didn't want to do Freedom of Choice record again and with those sounds and with that producer. We didn't even want to do that. So they were really freaked by that, really disappointed in us.
It's always been the paradox of the mainstream record business. Back when there was a record business, the paradox was always that something surprising would come out. It would take people by surprise and they'd be charmed by it, and then it would become popular. And then the impulse of the record business was, for some reason, not let's have more surprises.
No.
But let's have more
of the
thing that was just successful.
Yeah.
That's a trap that sank a lot of boats back when there was a record business.
Absolutely. So now, before we go, how did you get so good at poker? And is poker for you like winemaking for me, where there's a relationship between you as a musician and producer with poker, but it's also freedom in another area?
I've been a serious poker player for some time, and I go to the World Series of Poker every year, and I try really hard every year. But you can't expect to win one of these tournaments because hundreds of people enter, and cards have to go your way, and you also have to make very few mistakes. But winning a tournament is within the reach of any decent poker player. I happened to win one this year, which was great and very satisfying. And, long story short, the money is really good. When you win a tournament like that, you get a lot of money. And that's why you do it.
Yeah.
Poker might actually be the one thing in my life that I do for the money, in that if there wasn't money in it, I wouldn't do it.
Got it.
But it's also a completely separate realm of my life. Like, none of the thinking that I use playing cards is applicable to any other part of my life.
Okay, that's what I was asking.
When you're playing cards, a big part of your job is to be inscrutable. On a spectrum between inscrutable and deceptive.
Right.
You don't want your opponents to know what you're thinking or why you're doing what you're doing, right? And in my normal day-to-day life, I don't want to behave that way. I'm not a fucking psychopath, you know. If you ask me a question and I answer it, I want you to have some confidence in my answer. You know?
You're real, yeah.
And so the thinking that is required to play the game of poker is unique to that.
So you get to be an actor.
In a way, you're working within a certain sphere that has its own internal logic. And if you breach that sphere into another part of your life and use that same logic, it's gonna be a terrible fit, you know. In poker, you're always trying to exploit mistakes that your opponents make. And in my personal life, if you make a mistake, I want you to correct that mistake. I want to help you get out of the situation. I don't want to put my foot on you.
Right.
I don't want to make it worse for you. You know, so
that's a big part of the game, because I assume that anybody good, they all know the same calculus about what these combos they're going to get out of these hands they're dealt, and what to throw away and what to keep, and what they can do mathematically to increase their chances. That's the skill. And then there's the luck, but now you're talking about acting.
Well, there's a psychological element, which is, it's overplayed a lot in the popular culture where, you know, like the big tough guy makes a big bluff on the river and everybody's terrified and throws their hands away, that sort of stuff. That's overplayed dramatically, but it is an element. Like there is an element of sort of coercive psychology in poker, which again, I don't want to manifest itself in my real life. Like I don't want to manipulate other people, and I don't want other people to be trying to manipulate me. So you sit down at this table in a tournament, and it's an alternate reality for you. Yeah, I'm using parts of my brain that get no exercise in the rest of my life. And I feel like that is as different from the rest of my life as, you know, riding a horse is from shooting a shotgun. Like they're both completely different exercises.
I know, I'm admiring it. I'm in awe of it because I'm a terrible gambler, so I don't gamble. I loved playing blackjack in Vegas, and I would lose my ass every time.
Yeah.
And watch my friend Michael Nash, who's the senior vice president of Universal Music Group, win, because he's so into it.
Well, all poker players, myself included, would make a distinction between general gambling and poker. In general gambling, something like blackjack, you can play correctly and still the house has an edge over you. If you play forever, you will eventually go broke, right? Or rolling the dice or playing roulette or any of these things.
Where it's more chance.
There is a statistical certainty that you will lose money if you play long enough.
But poker's more skill.
In poker, you can control the odds. Yeah. You can change the odds that you're offering your opponent by the value, the size of your bet, or whether you choose to bet or not. You can change the odds that you're being offered by declining to play in certain situations or playing in certain situations. You know, by being aware of the odds you're being offered, you can tell when it's a good or a bad proposition. In that sense, poker is much more of a game, a strategic game like chess, than it is gambling, like, say, I think the Raiders are going to win.
Right.
You know, or I would very much like the number 32 to come up. Sure. You know, things like that. Sure. That's stuff that's out of your control. You have no influence on the outcome. In poker, you have a pretty significant influence on the outcome a lot of the time.
Yeah, even from what I knew about poker and watching it, I always thought it was a game of skill. It's
been a legal struggle for poker to be recognized as a game of skill. And that changes the way poker players have to behave. In some parts of the country, poker players, you know, have to be underground. They can't be open or public about what they're doing because it's technically illegal. In other places, it's seen as just another normal pastime.
Yeah.
So, I think the distinction that poker players make between sort of general gambling and poker is embodied in their behavior as well. Very few poker players that are successful long-term are also degenerate gamblers in other areas. There are a lot of players who are degenerate gamblers who also play poker, and that is a significant fraction of the population. But there are a lot of poker players like me. Like I don't throw dice. I don't put money on any games of chance, pure chance. I don't bet on sports. I'm just not interested in gambling. And there are a lot of poker players like me.
I knew by asking you that question that I would get an in-depth answer that would be really enlightening. So, thanks. It even went beyond what I could have imagined.
So
You're a thoughtful guy.
I have one final question, then I guess I can let you go.
All
One
right.
final question about Devo. When my friends and I were getting into punk rock, Devo became one of the most popular bands in the world on a mass appeal scale. The quirkiness of Devo, and the oddity of Devo, which we all identified with, was used against us by the Squares.
Right.
In that we were all called Devo mockingly by the Squares. Did you experience being called Devo by somebody who didn't get Devo?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many, back in the days when fans wrote fan letters and we would get hundreds and thousands of letters and then talk to fans after concerts, I can't tell you how many people said exactly what you said. And we understood it because it happened to us. Devo, the word, became an adjective or a noun in the culture, just synonymous with being different, being disenfranchised, being an outsider of any kind. You know, if a kid cut his hair short or had blue highlights in his hair or had glasses with red rims, we would be told over and over how he got chased or beat up or punched and how guys jumped out of a car screaming, "You're Devo," and slapped him around, you know, over and over and over. So I just think that while the whole punk movement certainly appealed to all the kids who felt left out of the preppy scene, mainstream, it became easy once Devo became popular to lump it all together iconically into the one word.
Yeah.
It was just, you know, it's like saying Xerox,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. You gave it a brand.
Yeah. So yeah, Devo became a badge of courage in a way because you were going to get threatened. You were going to get beat up. That's it.
It's a sour note to end on, but that's where we are.
Steve, Jerry, you may have ended on a sour note, but what a sweet conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the Talkhouse.
Hey, if you enjoyed hearing Jerry Casale talk, he wrote an amazing piece for Talkhouse a couple years ago about the band/guy Tobacco.
Headline, Tobacco is Addictive. Big thanks to Desert Daze for having the Talkhouse out to your fantastic festival, and thanks to Talkhouse's Keenan Kush for recording today's conversation.
Our producer is Mark Yoshizumi, and the Talkhouse Podcast theme song is by The Range.
Listeners, have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Thanksgiving. We'll be back the week after with Jabuki Young White in conversation with the drums, followed by fantastic episodes like Nico Case with Eric Bachman, Tierra Whack with Nnamdi Ogbenaya, and Tom Berlin with David Bazan. Till then, I'm Elia Einhorn.
I'm Josh Modell.
Peace. Enjoy your tofurkey.